guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, "Neighbor ran a huge extension cord from his home to my property to steal my electricity." I will never understand why people think that just because someone is old doesn't mean that they can't see the crap that is going on around them. Now, while the home is technically my property and house, I am not the main person living there. I travel a lot for work, and when I say a lot, I mean that I am home maybe half the days of the month. When I am home, I am not seen much by neighbors, so some might be surprised to hear that I live there. The person who is mainly living in the house is my mother, who after my father died didn't want to live alone or in that house anymore. As her only child, I of course let her come and live at my house where she could still have her privacy and independence, but still have someone else living with her. Anyway, neighbor didn't realize that I existed and slowly started taking advantage of the fact that he thought the only occupant of the house was an older woman. My mother, though, has all of her faculties and can very clearly see the stuff that neighbor tries to pull on us. She actually didn't tell me much about it until around the holidays, when she was so upset and told me that she had gotten presents for me and her friends, but they never came to the house. She isn't great with technology, but she knows how to order and track, so it says they got delivered. She doesn't really understand how the Ring camera works, and I mainly have it in case there is an emergency when I'm not home and someone breaks in. Looking back at past footage, though, I can see neighbor coming up to the porch repeatedly and taking boxes off of it and running off. This got me angry and asked my mother to tell me if there was anything else that was going on that I didn't know about. It turns out that she had been having problems with neighbor for a while now. She didn't want to tell me because she was worried about me having any more stress on top of my job. She is a treasure of a woman. I find out that this guy has also been deciding trash cans were too got for him, and instead has just been dumping his trash on our property near where we keep the bins. I probably would have been angrier, but I still thought the theft was the bigger issue. I put in a police report that basically didn't lead to anything because, as anyone who has had a package stolen before knows, they don't care in most places. Maybe someone out there lives in a place where the police would have done something, but it isn't here. Instead, I told her that if he did anything else to call me right away, even if I was away for work. After years of taking care of me and helping me in life, I wasn't about to let anyone walk all over my mother. It only took about a week before I got a call from her about neighbor. She kept saying she was sorry to disturb me and didn't know what to do about it. I was actually on a train home and would be there in a couple hours. Still, I asked her to tell me now so I could be up to date when I got there. It turns out that neighbor had taken one of those giant extension cords that I honestly only ever see for like outdoor Christmas decorations and ran it from his property to mine. I already knew what he was probably up to, and the fact my mother told me the lights kept flickering confirmed it in my mind. Neighbor was actually trying to save money by stealing electricity from my home. A decent amount too, since I asked my mom to turn everything she could off and there was still barely enough power to keep the essentials going. I was fuming mad and couldn't wait to give neighbor a piece of my mind. I was always taught by her to keep a level head, though, and instead I called the police and explained the situation. They told me it wasn't emergent, but they promised to get someone out as soon as they could. I got home and was there for about an hour until they showed up, and I took them out back to show them. They asked both of us if we gave neighbor permission, and we both told him we didn't. Another officer who was following the cord came and said that it seemed to be hooked up to a generator. So yeah, it was clear he was stealing my electricity. I asked the officers if I could come when they knocked on his door to talk to his as well, and they said as long as I was civil it shouldn't be an issue. When they asked him why he was stealing my electricity, he looked totally shocked. He said that he wasn't, and his grandmother lived next door and was letting him use her electricity until he had money to pay his bill. I then finally informed him that I was the owner of the home and the woman he claims to be his grandmother was actually my mother. He went pale, not realizing that I owned the house and that he wasn't going to get away with it. He tried changing his story, but the police could tell that it was a total lie after that first story and arrested him. He ended up getting charged with quite a few things, surprisingly. Apparently, theft of services is a thing and applies and isn't exactly the same as regular theft. If he stole something, he would owe what he took and then a fine. for theft of services, though they don't want to just slap you on the wrist, and it is hard to estimate the worth of what was taken and how it can be rectified. Those things all seem to be at the discretion of the judge to a certain degree. This one gave him community service and forced him to pay the cost of what our monthly electric bill would have been. Again, he tried to claim my mother told him he could and probably just forgot. After hearing from her, they could tell she was sharp mentally and didn't believe him. I know that some of you are going to ask me, since I got him arrested for that, why didn't I get him for the stolen packages at the same time? Since it was a totally different crime, it would have to have gone to trial separately, and like I said before, the police didn't really want to pursue it. Since it was my mother also that got the packages, I didn't want to make her deal with all of that if she didn't want to. She didn't, and said that the right thing to do is to just let the presents go. Honestly, she was my level head in this whole thing that caused me to not say or do anything that he could have probably used against me. The next story is titled, "But I Didn't Retire." My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a longtime nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours, to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim for unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official, no overtime, policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite, no overtime, policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours in order to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 workdays just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee both verbally and in writing that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit, retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned/retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards which had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock acting as though nothing had happened and greeted everyone with a "good morning" as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point, Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ travel agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding onto her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired or retires, made sure to check the box labeled "retired" for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. The last story is titled, "Got into a car accident and now I have to compensate for the other party's car hire." Hey guys, a few months ago I got into a car accident. I was at fault, and we let insurance handle the majority of it. I thought that would be the end of it. Now I'm being hit with a statement of claim by the other party to compensate for the car hire while their car was being repaired. Car was hired for about a month. The amount they are asking for is quite a substantial amount, a few thousands, and the pricing for per day hire seems very high as well. I'm really stressed over this. Is there anything I can do to avoid paying? Or is there anything I can do to lower the amount? Update. Thanks for the support and helpful comment, guys. After a lengthy wait time on the phone with the insurance company, they said that they will attempt to settle with the other party on the costs. I guess I panicked a little because I thought this issue had been set aside months ago and the statement of claim from lawyers came abruptly. I used to intern at a law firm, but being handed a statement of claim with no prior negotiations or contact was very confronting. Anyways, thanks again for the support. I think it's overlooked how meaning these comments are in calming and bring confidence to people. Thanks for listening.